Some rescue missions are considered impossible before they even begin. Deep inside the jungles of Vietnam, a 12-man special forces team had walked straight into an ambush. Enemy gunfire came from every direction. The radio crackled with desperate voices. "Mayday! We need help!" Then, silence. At a nearby base, one man heard the call. He wasn't ordered to go. No one expected him to, because he wasn't even assigned to that mission. But Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez didn't wait for permission. He ran toward the helicopter. Someone shouted, "You're unarmed." He didn't stop. He grabbed only a medical bag and a combat knife. As the helicopter lifted off, Roy knew something. The men trapped below had almost no chance of surviving. Minutes later, the helicopter reached the landing zone. Bullets slammed into the aircraft. The pilot barely managed to hover. Without hesitation, Roy jumped. The moment his boots hit the ground, the jungle exploded with gunfire. Enemy soldiers were hidden everywhere. Every tree, every bush could hide death. Most men would have searched for cover. Roy Benavidez ran straight into the gunfire because somewhere ahead, American soldiers were still alive, and he had made one promise. No matter what happened, he would bring them home. The jungle was alive, not with birds, not with animals, but with gunfire. The moment Roy landed, enemy bullets ripped through the trees. Leaves exploded into the air. Branches snapped above his head. The wounded Green Berets were scattered across the battlefield. Some couldn't move. Others had almost run out of ammunition. Without wasting a second, Roy sprinted toward the nearest soldier. He grabbed him by the vest and dragged him behind cover. Then, another desperate voice called for help. Roy ran again. Bullets struck the ground, only inches away. Shrapnel tore into his back. Still, he refused to stop. One by one, he reached the wounded, bandaging injuries, returning fire with captured weapons, carrying ammunition to soldiers who were moments away from being overrun. The enemy kept closing in. Every rescue became more dangerous than the last. Then, a burst of automatic fire slammed into Roy. One bullet hit his leg. Another ripped into his side. The pain was unbearable. Most men would have fallen. Roy Benavidez forced himself back onto his feet. He looked around and realized several Americans were still trapped in the open. If he didn't reach them, no one would. Taking one deep breath, he stepped back into the storm of bullets. The battle was only getting worse, and Roy had no idea that before the day ended, his body would be pierced by dozens of wounds. Yet somehow, he would still refuse to die. The rescue had barely begun. Enemy fighters kept closing in. Their numbers seemed endless. Roy Benavidez ignored the bullets, ignored the pain. His only mission was to bring every man home. A wounded radio operator lay trapped only a few yards away. Roy sprinted toward him. Gunfire erupted. A bullet smashed into his thigh. He stumbled, but never stopped. He reached the soldier, lifted him onto his shoulders, and carried him back to the helicopter. The crew pulled the wounded man aboard. Roy turned around and ran back. Again, most rescuers would have left. Roy refused. He knew others were still out there. Back inside the jungle, the firefight became even more violent. Enemy soldiers attacked from every direction. Grenades exploded only feet away. Flying shrapnel cut into his arms, his face, and his chest. Blood soaked his uniform. Still, he kept moving. He gathered classified documents, picked up, dropped weapons, dragged another wounded soldier to safety, then another, and another. Every trip meant running through enemy fire. Every return could have been his last. The helicopter crew watched in disbelief. No one could understand how one man was still standing. By now, Roy had been wounded again and again, but he never asked to be rescued. He only asked, "Is everyone else aboard?" The answer was no, and that meant he was going back into the jungle one more time. Hours had passed. The jungle was still burning. The rescue helicopter was overloaded with wounded soldiers. Roy Benavidez was the last man still on the ground. He made one final sweep, searching every patch of grass, every broken tree, every silent body. No one would be left behind. As he turned back, a burst of enemy fire hit him again. Bullets tore through his body. A grenade exploded nearby. Shrapnel ripped into his face, his arms, and his legs. Then, an enemy soldier charged toward him. The two men fought at arm's length. Roy defended himself and survived. Barely able to stand, he lifted one final wounded teammate and carried him to the helicopter. Only then did he climb aboard. The aircraft lifted off, still under heavy fire. Inside, the medics rushed to save everyone. Then they reached Roy. His body was covered in blood. He wasn't moving. His breathing was almost impossible to detect. His pulse could barely be felt. Someone quietly said, "He's gone." A body bag was brought over, but just before they closed the zipper, Roy gathered the last bit of strength he had left. He spat directly into the medic's face. The medic froze, then shouted, "He's alive!" Against every expectation, against every medical prediction, Roy Benavidez had survived. But the greatest honor was still years away. The battle was finally over, but Roy Benavidez was still fighting. This time, not against the enemy, but against death itself. Doctors rushed him into an emergency field hospital. His uniform was soaked with blood. Bullet wounds covered his body. Shrapnel had torn through his arms, his legs, and his face. Every breath was a struggle. The medical team looked at each other. One doctor quietly whispered, "I don't think he's going to make it." For hours, surgeons worked without stopping. They removed bullets, stopped the bleeding, repaired shattered bones. But Roy's condition only grew worse. At one point, the doctors believed there was nothing more they could do. His heartbeat almost disappeared. The room fell silent. Then, against every expectation, his heart started beating again. It wasn't a miracle. It was determination. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Roy couldn't walk. Even sitting up was painful. Some people thought his military career was over forever, but they didn't know who Roy Benavidez was. Every morning, he pushed himself far beyond the pain. One more step, one more breath, one more day. The same determination that carried wounded soldiers through a battlefield now carried him through recovery. Doctors watched in complete disbelief. The man who had been placed inside a body bag was learning to walk again. Yet, Roy never asked for medals, never asked to be called a hero. He only wanted to return to the soldiers who had become his family. But far away, another battle had just begun, a battle to prove what really happened on that terrifying day in Vietnam. Years passed. The war was over, but one question still remained. How could one man rescue so many soldiers while suffering dozens of wounds and receive so little recognition? Roy Benavidez never complained. He never chased medals. He believed the men he saved were reward enough. His commanders recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but there was one problem. Military rules required eyewitness testimony. The battlefield had been complete chaos. Many witnesses had been killed. Others couldn't be found. Without enough evidence, the recommendation was denied. Instead, Roy received the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest award for bravery. For most people, that would have been the end of the story, but history had one more surprise. Years later, a soldier who had survived that mission was finally located. He described everything Roy had done: running through enemy fire, rescuing the wounded, saving classified documents, refusing to leave until every survivor was safely aboard the helicopter. His testimony changed everything. The case was reopened. The evidence was undeniable. The nation had almost overlooked one of the greatest acts of courage in American military history. Now, it was finally time to give Roy Benavidez the honor he had truly earned. The White House was waiting, and so was the President of the United States. Years after the battle, Roy Benavidez walked through the gates of the White House, not as a wounded soldier, but as an American hero. The room was filled with military leaders, veterans, and the families of the men whose lives he had saved. Then, President Ronald Reagan stepped to the podium. He looked at Roy for a long moment. Then he smiled and said, "If the story of Roy Benavidez were a movie, no one would believe it." The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward Roy as the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. America's highest military award. Not for winning a battle, not for defeating an army, but for refusing to leave his brothers behind. The audience rose to their feet. The applause seemed endless. Some of the soldiers Roy had rescued were standing there, alive, because one man refused to quit. Roy didn't celebrate. He didn't call himself a hero. Instead, he quietly said, "I simply did what any soldier should do." Those words spoke louder than any medal ever could. But Roy's greatest legacy would never be the decoration around his neck. It would be the lives that continued, because he chose to risk his own, and that legacy would live forever. The Medal of Honor changed Roy Benavidez's life, but it never changed the man he was. He remained humble. He never claimed to be extraordinary. Whenever people called him a hero, he answered, "I was simply doing my job." For the rest of his life, Roy traveled across America. He visited military bases. He spoke to young soldiers. He reminded them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing, even when you're afraid. He never forgot the men who never came home. Every speech, every handshake, every story was dedicated to them. On November 29, 1998, Roy Benavidez passed away at the age of 63, but legends never truly die. Today, his Medal of Honor still shines. His name is remembered inside military academies. His story is studied by soldiers who dream of serving with honor. One rescue mission lasted only 6 hours, but its impact has lasted for generations. A poor boy who lost his parents, a wounded soldier who refused to surrender, a warrior who carried others when he could barely stand himself. Roy Benavidez didn't fight to become famous. He fought because his brothers needed him, and that is the true meaning of courage. Thank you for watching. If this true story inspired you, subscribe to Army of Valor, where history lives through the courage of real heroes, because legends are never forgotten.